Director General of UNESCO, Excellencies, Holocaust survivors and your families, veterans of the Second World War and your families, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor to welcome you all as you join us from around the world for the annual commemoration program in observance of the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. It is my privilege to serve as Master of Ceremonies. Today's commemorative program is being held virtually for the first time under the theme, Facing the Aftermath, Recovery and Reconstitution After the Holocaust. This year is the first time that the commemoration program has been jointly organized by the UN's Department of Global Communications and UNESCO. It is also my pleasure to acknowledge and thank our partner on this event, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. In addition, we are grateful to CNN International for its creative support to the commemoration program. We are enriched and strengthened through all our partnerships and collaborations. The views expressed by the panelists are their own and do not imply official endorsement by the United Nations and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Dear survivors, we are so pleased that you and your family and friends are here with us today. While this year we are not able to come together in person, we are together in spirit. When we look back on 2020, we see a year where the ugly faces of anti-Semitism, racism, and intolerance revealed themselves again and again. But we also witnessed compassion and solidarity, as well as protests against injustice. We gather here today to take a stand against anti-Semitism, to speak out against morally corrosive words and actions motivated by hatred, to speak for tolerance. We are here because we will not lose sight of what happened during the Holocaust. We are here to show that we cherish those who survived, to mourn the millions who perished at the hands of the Nazis and their racist collaborators. We are here to pledge to never, ever forget them. It is now my honor to introduce the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres. Mr. Secretary General, you have the floor.
Your Excellency, Chancellor Merkel, Excellencies, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. We meet today to commemorate the 76th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. We honor the memory of all the victims of the Holocaust, the 6 million Jews, and also the Roma and Sinti, people with disabilities, those of mixed descent, the LGBTQ community, Poles, Slavs, and all those who were persecuted and killed by the Nazis and their collaborators. Today's meeting takes place online under the shadow of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has already cost 2 million lives and sickened more than 90 million people around the world. The pandemic has put our societies to the test, revealing long-standing fractures and injustices. It has contributed to a resurgence in xenophobia and hate speech, including anti-Semitism, the oldest and most persistent form of racist and religious persecution. From Imperial Rome to medieval Europe and to the modern world, Jews and their communities have suffered 2 millennia of discrimination, attacks, expulsions, and periodic mass killings. Anti-Semitism found its most horrific expression in the Holocaust. The universal revulsion at this crime, followed by the founding of the United Nations and the signing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, promised an end. But it did not end. Indeed, today anti-Semitism is resurgent in many places around the world. As the number of Holocaust survivors diminishes every year, white supremacists and neo-Nazis intensify their efforts to deny, distort, and rewrite history, including of the Holocaust. In Europe, the United States, and elsewhere, white supremacists are organizing and recruiting across borders, shamelessly flaunting the symbols of the Nazis and their murderous ambitions. We saw shocking examples in this nation's capital in recent weeks. The COVID-19 pandemic has given them new opportunities to exploit social turmoil, turn people against each other, and target minorities based on religion, race, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, disability, and immigration status. After decades in the shadows, neo-Nazis and their ideas are gaining currency and even a kind of respectability. In some countries, their messages and ideology can be heard in some debates between mainstream political parties. In others, they have infiltrated police and state security services. Together, we must urgently strengthen our joint efforts against the danger they pose. Mesdames et messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, friends, this year our commemoration of the Holocaust has as its theme Facing the Aftermath, Recovery and Restitution After the Holocaust. For many Jews, the end of the Holocaust was only the beginning of an incredibly painful and arduous journey. No survivor of the Holocaust was ever able to carry on life as before. The Holocaust changed the world forever, making it impossible to go back. Today, as we are working to ensure that the world can recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, we can learn important lessons from the Holocaust. We must address the weaknesses and shortcomings that the pandemic has exposed, and strengthen the bonds that unite us, which are based on our common humanity. 2021 must be the year of healing, healing from the pandemic, and healing our broken societies within which hatred has too easily taken root. To recover, we must invest in social cohesion, so that all communities feel valued in themselves and as part of a greater whole. Political, religious, and community leaders must seek common ground and must find consensus. Throughout the world, the United Nations strives to help governments build inclusive, diverse, and respectful societies based on human rights and the rule of law, guided by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We need coordinated global action, commensurate with the threat that we are facing, to unite to combat the rise and spread of neo-Nazism and white supremacy, and to tackle propaganda and disinformation. Over the last 15 years, our outreach program on the Holocaust has conveyed the accounts of Holocaust survivors to the entire world. Our United Nations Plan of Action to Safeguard Religious Sites proposes concrete measures to support governments, so that all can exercise their right to observe their religious rituals in complete security. The UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech underscores our commitment to work together to combat this scourge.
distinguished guests, dear friends, the only way out of the COVID-19 pandemic is through science and fact-based analysis. The production of vaccines in record time is testimony to the power of science. But there is no vaccine for anti-Semitism and xenophobia. The most effective weapon remains the facts and the truth. The United Nations will continue to stand for the truth and against lies, bigotry, anti-Semitism, and hatred. Our best tribute to those who died in the Holocaust is the creation of a world of equality, justice, and dignity for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General. It is now my honor to introduce His Excellency, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, the President of the UN General Assembly. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
On this day, we honor the millions of Jews and the other groups who lost their lives during a time of unparalleled inhumanity in the middle of Europe. On this day, we remember those who survived the Holocaust and their pain. They were individuals just like the rest of us, mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, friends and neighbors, but they were treated as others. They became targets of hatred and violence because of who they are. This did not happen overnight. It was in the making for centuries. It began as intolerance and bigotry, evolved into a systematic campaign, and ended as genocide. Today we must never forget these facts. We must never lose sight of what went wrong, and we must ensure that it never happens again. Unfortunately, the recent developments are not promising. We are once again faced with a rising tide of racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism. We are witnessing hatred towards other minorities and religious groups. Today, the onus is upon us to uphold truth, equality, and protect the rights of the most vulnerable groups all around the world. We have to be vigilant to call out any injustice we witness and defend pluralism. We have to condemn intolerance, incitement, harassment based on ethnic origin or religious belief. We must instill within our children an understanding that every individual is entitled to equal dignity and inalienable human rights. Inertia is not an option. In memory of the victims of the Holocaust, I ask that we the peoples recommit to the Charter of the United Nations, which was written in the wake of the atrocities 75 years ago, and reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. It's now my pleasure to introduce Her Excellency, Ms. Audrey Azoulay, Director General of UNESCO. Ms. Azoulay, you have the floor.
We are gathered here today from across the world on this day chosen by the United Nations to remember the victims of the Shoah. The 27th of January, 76 years ago to the day since Soviet troops entered the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. Upon this day, we are all called upon to assume our responsibility, that of remembering what happened yesterday and what is happening here and now. More than ever before, we must then act and fight against amnesia, distortion of facts. We must not give any ground to deceivers or demagogues, and we must do this by using the powerful forces of memory and education. Not only to weep for the dead today, but also to warn the living, in the words of the late and much missed Samuel Pizarro, who was our special envoy for this topic.
Ladies and gentlemen, fighting oblivion, this is UNESCO's aim and mission in supporting Holocaust research, commemoration and education. This mission is all the more essential today, and with the involvement of our partners, we have stepped up our actions to address teachers and pupils, first of all. Thanks to the financial support of Canada, we will soon be holding a new edition of the International Conference on Education and the Holocaust, training educators across the globe in cooperation with the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. This year, we've also incorporated new content for teachers, trainers, and school directors on addressing anti-Semitism in schools as a result of our partnership with the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights and University College London, whom I thank. All of our resources on preventing anti-Semitism will soon be accessible on a website developed by the UNESCO chair at the University of Southern California's Shoah Foundation. But we're also addressing governments to fight all attempts to deny or distort facts, falsify the past, or excuse the inexcusable. With the European Commission, we have launched a campaign to debunk online hate speech and conspiracy theories, particularly anti-Semitic statements. Now, building on this initiative, we are developing a guide for educators to help young people critically assess online content. In partnership with the United Nations, the University of Oxford, and the World Jewish Congress, we have launched a global study to map the sources and channels of Holocaust distortion and denial on social media and help educators respond to it more effectively. And also, with the World Jewish Congress, we have developed the website aboutholocaust.org to provide reliable and easily accessible information on the genocide of the Jewish people. It is now available in 19 languages. And I'm pleased to announce today that as a result of a good collaboration with Facebook, the social media platform will, as of today, connect people with the new website at the top of relevant search results, so the public is better informed online. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations and UNESCO were built on the ashes of the Second World War, so that the international community could prevent these horrors from ever being repeated. Raymond Aron wrote in 1947, "Perhaps the supreme virtue would be to look in humanity in the face without losing faith in humans." This truth is even more evident in the unstable and uncertain global context we're currently living in, which could either be fertile ground for all forms of regression or an opportunity to commit to a new renaissance, educational, scientific, and cultural. I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wonderful performance. It is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Her Excellency Ms. Angela Merkel, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. Chancellor Merkel, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, 76 years ago today, on the 27th of January 1945, the concentration and extermination camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau was liberated. What happened there, and in many other places where atrocities were committed during the National Socialist period, is and remains beyond belief. I am deeply ashamed of the Shoah, of that betrayal of all civilized values perpetrated under the National Socialist regime. It is and remains Germany's everlasting responsibility to remember these events and to commemorate the victims, the European Jews, the Sinti and Roma, the political prisoners and members of the intelligentsia in Poland, the prisoners of war from the Soviet Union and other countries, the resistance fighters, the homosexuals, the people with disabilities, and countless other men, women, and children who were humiliated, persecuted, tortured, and murdered. We must never forget these people and their fates. My special thanks go to the survivors who mustered the strength to tell the story of their lives. Their first-hand accounts show us just how vulnerable human dignity is and how easily the values that underpin peaceful coexistence can be violated. We must stand with the utmost determination against anti-Semitism, be it open or veiled, and against denial or diminishing of the Holocaust. We are guided by this conviction also during the German presidency of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Today is the first time that this event has been organized jointly by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the United Nations, and UNESCO. I am very grateful for this special demonstration of unity and resolve. For it is not only on anniversaries and remembrance days that our resolve is needed, but every day. We must be constantly vigilant to ensure that we cede no ground to anti-Semitism and racism. We honor the victims of the Holocaust by remembering them and by learning from their plight. That is our everlasting responsibility for today's and future generations.
Thank you, Chancellor. Words. I would now like to introduce our next speaker, His Excellency Mr. Erwin Coulter, Canada's Special Envoy on Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
We meet at an important moment of remembrance and reminder, marking the liberation of the death camp Auschwitz, the most brutal extermination camp of the 20th century, of the unprecedented horrors of the Holocaust and the universal messages for our time, including the danger of forgetting and the responsibility, the imperative of remembrance, le devoir de mémoire, of the mass murder of 6 million Jews and millions of non-Jews, not as abstract statistics, but unto each person there is a name, of the demonization of the Jew as prologue and justification for the mass murder. As the Supreme Court of Canada put it, the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. Of the Holocaust as a paradigm for radical evil, as anti-Semitism is a paradigm for radical hate. Of the danger of Holocaust distortion and denial. Of the responsibility to educate, and we will be joining with UNESCO in prioritizing the combating of anti-Semitism and genocide prevention education. Of the danger of silence in the face of evil and the responsibility to prevent and protect. Of remembrance and tribute to Holocaust survivors who endured the worst of inhumanity and have made an enduring contribution to our communities. Of remembrance and paying tribute to the rescuers like Raoul Wallenberg, who demonstrated how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil, prevail, and transform history. And so may this day be not only an act of remembrance, which it is, may it also be a remembrance to act on behalf of our common humanity.
Thank you for those words. Our next speaker is His Excellency Mr. Gilad Menashe Erdan, Permanent Representative of Israel to the United Nations. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
President of the General Assembly, Volkan Bozkir, Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez, distinguished survivors and speakers, ladies and gentlemen. This year, we are commemorating International Holocaust Remembrance Day in the midst of a deadly pandemic. The dangers of COVID-19 are not only medical. One of the biggest symptoms of COVID-19 is hate. The crisis has caused a resurgence of anti-Semitism, a virus much darker and more dangerous than the virus ravaging our world today. Conspiracy theories drawing on the tropes of blood libels are spewed, attacks are carried out, and the safety of Jews around the world is threatened in person and online. In his Nobel lecture, Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel spoke of the duty those who endured the Holocaust felt to share their experiences. We thought it would be enough to tell of the wave of hatred which broke over the Jewish people for men everywhere to decide once and for all to put an end to hatred of anyone who is different. Unfortunately, the pandemic has made clear that those lessons have not been internalized. Anti-Semitism is spreading, both in its old forms and in its new mutation, delegitimizing the world's only Jewish state. Yet, it is ignored and even tolerated by too many. We must learn from the tragedies of the past, which are already threatening the present, in order to protect our future. The tyrannical Iranian regime promotes Holocaust denial and openly repeats its intention of annihilating the only Jewish state. In a tweet this past October, Iranian leader Ayatollah Khamenei asked, "Why is it a crime to raise doubts about the Holocaust?" He regularly uses anti-Semitic slurs and calls for the destruction of Israel. Yet, the world once again stands idly by as the Jewish people are threatened by a genocidal regime. The international community cannot allow the Iranian regime to acquire nuclear weapons and spread terrorism and violence throughout the Middle East. It cannot wait again for millions to be murdered before it takes action. All four of my grandparents survived the Holocaust, 3 having suffered the atrocities of Auschwitz. They rebuilt their lives in Israel, the homeland of our forefathers, and a promise to protect future generations. The State of Israel will continue to defend the Jewish people. On this important day, the international community must recommit itself to join Israel in that effort. Just as the world has fought the virus of COVID-19, so must it commit to eradicating all forms of the virus that is anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Ambassador Erdan. I would like to introduce our next speaker, His Excellency Mr. Richard M. Mills, Charge d'Affaires at the United Nations Mission to the United Nations. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished guests, survivors. As we gather on this solemn day, it is incumbent upon us to confront the horrors of the Holocaust and resolve never to let its history be denied or its chilling lessons be lost. We commemorate the 6 million Jews, the Roma, Slavs, persons with disabilities, gays and lesbians, and many other victims targeted for persecution and murder by the Nazi regime. This genocide is a historical fact. Yet more than 75 years after liberation of the camps, anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred are an alarming part of our present-day reality. People around the world continue to be vilified, suffer discrimination, and be violently attacked because of their race, religion, ethnicity, disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity. We still have much work to do together to ensure that never again truly means never. This year's theme, Facing the Aftermath, Recovery and Reconstitution After the Holocaust, demands that we take seriously our obligation to remember, to absorb, and to teach the history of the Holocaust. We must not be silent when others discount or distort the truth of what happened. All of us must be persistent, intentional, and proactive about ensuring younger generations are fully educated about the Holocaust so that they recognize not only the perils of permitting anti-Semitism, but also that anti-Semitism, if left unchecked, often portends broader manifestations of hatred and political and social conflict to come. The United States will never shrink from its commitment to combat anti-Semitism. We honor the sacred memory of those murdered in the Holocaust when together we act to prevent future atrocities and uphold the rights and the dignity of all. Thank you.
Cantor Julia Cadrain of the Central Synagogue in New York will now recite memorial prayers, El Mel Rachamim, followed by the Kaddish. After the recital of prayers, we invite you to join us in observing a moment of silence for the victims of the Holocaust. Cantor Cadrain.
We rise in body or in spirit for the memorial prayer, El Male Rachamim. El Male Rachamim, Shochein Bamramim, Hamsei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, Bema'alot Kedoshim Uteharim, Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim, Et Nishmot Shisha Million Acheinu Ve'achiotenu Shenehargu al Kiddush Hashem Ma'al Harachamim Yastirein Beseter Kenafav Lolamim Vitzror, Vitzror HaChaim Et Nishmatam Adonai Hu Nachalatam Ve'yanuchu B'Shalom Al Mishkavam Ve'namar Amen. fully compassionate God, eternal Spirit of the universe, to the millions who were murdered, grant clear and certain rest with you in the lofty heights of the sacred and pure, whose brightness shines like the glow of heaven. Source of mercy, forever enfold them in your embrace. Secure their souls into eternity. Adonai, they are yours. They will rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. We continue with the Mourner's Kaddish. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, be'alma divrach chirutei ve'amlich malchutei, b'chayechon uvyomechon uv'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael, ba'gala uv'yizman kariv ve'imru, Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam ulmei almaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yithalal shemei d'kudashah brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata, tush bechata v'nechemata, da'amiran be'alma, v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. May the one who makes peace above make peace for all of us. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael.
Thank you, Cantor Cadrain, for leading us so beautifully in the prayers. We are fortunate to have with us a Holocaust survivor, Dr. Irena Butter, in conversation with her granddaughter, Shireen Nasser, and CNN's chief international correspondent, Ms. Clarissa Ward. Dr. Butter will share with us her story of endurance, loss, survival, and hope.
Thank you both so much for joining me for this important conversation. I wanted to start out by asking you, Dr. Butter, how did you survive the Holocaust? Tell us about your experience, how you got through it, and what you learned from it.
Well, mine is a story of a Jewish child growing up during the Holocaust in Nazi-occupied Europe. I was born in Berlin in 1930. Hitler came to power when I was 3 years old, and gradually the persecution of the Jews developed. Now, my grandfather owned a bank in Berlin, and my father was partner, and the bank was taken away from him. And so my father was unemployed, and he went to Amsterdam to look for employment and also to try to escape Hitler. The family moved to Amsterdam in 1937, but after 2 years, the Nazis invaded Holland, and Holland became a Nazi-occupied country, and persecution of the Jews escalated. We were deported to 2 concentration camps. First, a German concentration camp in Holland, and then to Bergen-Belsen in Germany, because my father had managed to apply for Ecuadorian passports, thinking that that might save our lives. So Bergen-Belsen had an exchange camp, where people were meant to be exchanged eventually. After 1 year of horrible conditions, my family barely survived, but we had the fortune of being included in a prisoner exchange program administered by the Nazis because of these Ecuadorian passports. But then, sadly, my father died on the train to Switzerland. And when we arrived in Switzerland, my mother and my brother were hospitalized immediately. Since I was not as sick as they were, I was separated as a 14-year-old and sent to a refugee camp in Algiers in North Africa. The war had not yet ended, and for several months there was no communication. But eventually, I stayed in this camp for almost 1 year and arrived in America December 1945. I was separated from my mother and my brother for 18 months before we were reunited in New York to start a new life. So that is my story. Lived in the United States ever since and was lucky to take advantage of so many opportunities.
It's so hard for some of us to understand or begin to imagine the horrors of what you witnessed. How did you stay strong? How did you stay positive?
Well, for one, I was with my family until we were liberated from the camp and my father died and I was separated from my mother and my brother, and that I think made a big difference. Also, I had a wonderful childhood and I attribute my resilience to that to a very large extent. And I think I would add that not giving up hope was a very critical thing, to hope that the war will end, that I will survive, and that I'll have a normal life again.
And Shireen, when did you first learn about your grandmother's extraordinary story, and what was it like to grow up knowing and understanding and having this unique window onto history?
Yeah, so I actually heard about her story at a very, very young age. I think my mom told me this story originally, and I remember being terrified, especially as a little girl, knowing that something so horrible could happen in our world and, somebody from my own family. It was difficult. It was very difficult, and I think it's difficult for me to until this day, to be honest. Um, but I grew up in Israel actually, and Holocaust Remembrance Day is a very big day back home in Israel. Each year, everything is shut down. There is a minute within that day that the whole country stops and stands up in remembrance of the people who suffered in the Holocaust. And you can see in the highways, even the cars stop and people stand out of the cars and really think about these people that survived. And I feel very, very fortunate to have a grandmother that is so, so strong, that has survived something like this. And I've learned so much from her.
And what an extraordinary privilege that is. I know that for you, Dr. Butter, it took a long time before you were able to talk about your experiences from when you first arrived in the US. What allowed you, or what prompted you to take on a more public role in discussing what you went through?
Well, I would say one of the main influences was Elie Wiesel, because he was on the forefront of Holocaust survivors, and he encouraged them to provide testimony and to be witnesses. He considered that to be a duty. I once heard him speak on the radio, and he said, if you were in the camps, if you smelled the air and heard the silence of the dead, then it's your duty to be a witness. and to tell the story. 40 years for me to start speaking about it. I took it very seriously and started giving talks in schools, and I have done that ever since.
You talk about the importance of hope. You talk about the importance of speaking out. What do you want the younger generation, Shireen and Shireen's friends, to take away from the horrors that you went through?
Well, I think we learned something. There are, again, echoes of the Holocaust. And on January 6th, we saw it in our own country when there was an attempted coup and rioting in Washington, D.C., and some of the rioters wore Nazi symbols and used Nazi slogans. So it's right back here. And I think we learned from it. I think we learned that democracy is vulnerable and we cannot take anything for granted. But it is up to us, to the people, to preserve and protect our democratic institutions and our Constitution. And so I think everyone in this country needs to be educated, both students and adults, that we have that responsibility to be active citizens and to confront hatred and to confront the violations of our democracy. And in that way, it can be preserved and protected. And that's my hope, never to be a bystander, and that every person can make a difference in keeping this a democratic country and not to let it be turned over to authoritarianism.
And Shireen, what about you? When you look at your generation, your friends, what would you like to see young people today embrace and embody from the lessons, the horrors, the experiences that your grandmother has gone through?
Yeah, I think we can't become numb to what's happening. We have to continue and be awake, and act. That's what my grandmother said about never being a bystander. I take that with me every day. I speak up. It's very easy to kind of get immersed in the day to day, but there are a lot of things that are happening around us, and it's really important to speak up.
And Dr. Butter, if I can ask you just more generally, when you look globally across the world, we see a worrying trend. We see a rise in anti-Semitism across the world. What's your response to that? How do you think people should be working to combat that?
Well, to be conscious of it, to interrupt, to not just listen and not respond to it. And America has been in front of the preserving freedom and democracy in this world. And so I think it has always been looked at as a shining example of equality, freedom, and liberty. And so it's very important in this country that we confront these acts and these ideologies that don't belong here, as well as anywhere in the world. There is a trend towards authoritarianism and discrimination against certain kinds of people. So we have to be vigilant, and we can't just not talk to people who hold these opinions and these viewpoints. We must confront it and try to silence it.
So, what gives you hope? You talked about the importance of hope. You've been through so much already. What is it that still gives you hope every morning?
Well, there's good in every person, and I concentrate on young people because I've been talking in schools for more than 35 years, and the responses I receive from students to my story who put themselves in my shoes and try to relate their own lives to it, that is what gives me hope. And I hope that there will be more attention paid in our educational systems to morality, to ethical values, and to stamp out hatred, because we're all made of the same fabric, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, religion, or any other differences. There are differences, but I think that our humanity overrides all these differences.
Wise and inspiring words. Dr. Butter, Shireen, thank you both so much for your time and for sharing your story with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Butter, for sharing your experiences so generously with us, and also your call on us to never be a bystander. You inspire us. Thank you also, Shireen, for joining us in conversation with your dear grandmother, and to Ms. Ward for contributing to a very special and memorable conversation. Friends, we asked a few people around the world to share with us why learning and teaching about the Holocaust remains important. Let's listen.
The learning of the Holocaust is not only important, it's crucial. It's a matter of knowledge of the past, but for a better and wider understanding of our tasks and responsibilities for today and for our common future.
My name is Mark Maseko from the UN Information Center in Lusaka, Zambia. I think young people should remember and learn about the Holocaust so that in future generations there's no denial that the Holocaust ever happened. It is only when we keep the Holocaust memorial alive shall we truly say, never again shall such atrocities ever happen again.
I have spent 30 years teaching, researching, and writing about the Holocaust because it offers my students, my readers, and me a source of insight. Holocaust Studies offers us a vocabulary to talk about the grave problems we face today, and it offers us knowledge and insight to help us understand, analyze, and interpret the world in which we live.
I'm Professor Salah Jabari. I'm the UNESCO Chair on Genocide Prevention Studies in the Islamic world at University of Baghdad. It's so important for the new younger generations to learn more about genocide in the world in order to know its negative impacts on society and to encourage them to enhance peace and their cultural diversity, in addition to spread the culture of tolerance and coexistence.
The Holocaust was an unprecedented genocide, unprecedented because of its global form. Not only Jews of Europe, but of the whole world were intended to be annihilated. It was totally unpragmatic. It was purely ideologically. It ran counter to the interests of Nazi Germany, economically, politically, even militarily. And this is a precedent. It can be repeated, not in exactly the same form, nothing ever is, but in similar forms, and it has already been in that form. And so when we deal with mass atrocity crimes today, with genocides today, we need to start from the Holocaust. That is the basic importance of not just of remembering, but acting in accordance with the history that we are witnesses of. Thank you.
My name is Agiram Sityanova and I am from Kazakhstan. As a human rights professional, I truly believe the Holocaust education with the analysis of contemporary issues is one of the most efficient tools to achieve equality. With the rising xenophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, discrimination against different vulnerable groups, Holocaust education will prevent us from seeing horrors of war.
In a film that was recently released covering the story of the spell at the Łódź ghetto in September 1942, where during 3 days 15,000 Jewish children were deported from the ghetto to concentration camps, never came back. The very last sentence is said by an old Jew, Holocaust survivor from Łódź, who said, "Once we're all gone from this world, all the Holocaust survivors, the point of view that would be taken looking back at the events will be so far away, it will be like looking from a satellite on the Jewish history in World War II." And this is why I now am dedicating 8 years of my life finding new dimensions, new ways of storytelling in regards of the Holocaust. For me, it's comics and animation that can explore for educational purposes all over the world to keep the story alive.
We meet at an important moment of remembrance and reminder of the 76th anniversary of the liberation of the death camp Auschwitz, of the Holocaust as a paradigm for radical evil, as anti-Semitism is a paradigm for radical hate. 1.3 million people were deported to the death camp Auschwitz. 1.1 million of them were Jews. Let there be no mistake about it. Jews were murdered at Auschwitz because of anti-Semitism. But anti-Semitism did not die at Auschwitz. It remains the bloody canary in the mineshaft of global evil today. And as we've learned only too painfully, while it begins with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews.
My name is Memorich Peter and I'm coming from Lusaka, Zambia. I'm age 15. I have learned about the Holocaust and I feel it's very important for the future generation to also learn about it because it teaches us the importance of coexistence, conflict prevention, and it also promotes peace among different racial, religious, and cultural groups. Above all, it ensures respect for dignity and human rights of people all over the world, but not only in my country, Zambia.
Thank you to all who contributed their thoughts to that rich tapestry of voices. You remind us of the ways in which the Holocaust continues to resonate and why it is integral to understanding who we are as a human family. Dear guests, today we reflect and remember the victims of the Holocaust. We remember that each person had a name, had a dream, had hopes. We reflect on the strength, courage, and resilience that it took for those who escaped to find meaning in their own survival. Dear survivors, you continue to inspire us as we work to make the world a more just and humane place for all. Let us pause and listen to the violinist and UNESCO Artist for Peace, Renaud Capuçon, performing Nijun from the Baal Shem Suite by Ernest Bloch. Mr. Capuçon is accompanied by the pianist Guillaume Bellhomme. Thank you, Mr. Capuçon and Mr. Bellhomme. Integral to the process of reconstitution in the aftermath of the Holocaust was the accurate rendering of its history. Unfortunately, forms of Holocaust denial and distortion remain prevalent, finding fertile ground to spread online. We must counter disinformation online designed to spread hate, distort historical evidence, or deny the Holocaust entirely. Instead, we must make truth and compassion go viral. The CNN journalist, Ms. Hala Gorani, will moderate the next part of our commemorative program, a discussion with a diverse panel of experts on Holocaust distortion and denial. The views expressed by the panelists are their own and do not imply official endorsement by the United Nations and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance.
Hello, my name is Hala Gorani, and I'm an anchor on CNN. Today, I'm honored to be hosting a discussion with some of the world's most eminent authors and historians on this International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today's discussion will center around the issues of Holocaust denial and distortion and how they are still big problems today. They feed anti-Semitism, of course, but they also feed hate crimes and conspiracy theories. Just a few weeks ago, a violent mob stormed Congress in Washington, D.C. One of the mobsters was wearing a t-shirt that read, "Welcome to Camp Auschwitz." Joining us today are Hella Pick, CBE, the legendary foreign correspondent and author and Kindertransport refugee. From Poland, Marian Turski, historian and journalist and one of the last surviving victims of the Holocaust. Professor Deborah Lipstadt, historian and author of many books, most recently, Anti-Semitism, Here and Now. Dr. Robert Williams of the U.S. Holocaust Museum and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Professor Philippe Sands, lawyer, specialist in international law, has argued many cases before the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, author of 17 books, his latest, The Rat Line, Love, Lies, and Justice on the Trail of a Nazi Fugitive. Thank you to all of you for joining us. So as I mentioned, the theme of today's discussion will center around Holocaust denial and distortion, some 75 years after the end of World War II. I want to start with Hella Pick, and I want to ask you, in all of your years covering the aftermath of World War II, anti-Semitism, hate crimes, crimes against humanity, how today do these big issues, the issues of Holocaust denial and distortion and misuse of Holocaust imagery, how do they still affect society today? Hella Pick.
Well, it remains with us, as you all know. And I have been very struck looking at the social media in the last few days to see that it is now commonplace to talk about Holocaust, and that this is now being linked, of course, to the Holocaust. And we are seeing in our contemporary world that this is being used by social media, particularly on the far right, to link today's assaults on democracy to the events of the Holocaust, which of course is a complete distortion of the situation. The Holocaust is, as we all know, completely one-off, unique, terrible happening, and using it today to create a dynamic between the attacks on democracy, of course, is doing a terrible attack on the memory of the Holocaust, and at the same time distorting our contemporary society.
Robert Williams, can you give us examples of Holocaust denial and distortion and how they differ from each other?
Sure. At the simplest level, within the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, we've identified, just on the distortion side, at least 9 different types of distortion that can appear. They can be something as obvious as excusing or minimizing the pure facts of the Holocaust to something that is a little less obvious, such as misusing Holocaust-related images, or venerating certain historical figures. And it's that last category that we're finding to be particularly problematic, even, as you say, more than 75 years since the end of the Holocaust. In a number of countries, whether those countries were occupied by the Nazis, part of the Axis alliance, neutral, or even on the side of the alliance with the United States and Great Britain and the Soviet Union, we are finding certain historical figures today being rehabilitated, for lack of a better word, made into national heroes, whether it was because they were part of an anti-communist resistance or they were cultural luminaries, it doesn't matter. By rehabilitating the reputations of these people, though, you actually open the door to more pernicious and dangerous forms of hate, distortion, and denial.
Okay. Philippe Sands, why today, do you think? Why is this resurfacing today in 2020-21?
I think that's an interesting question. There's obviously an ebb and a flow in history. I think one of the things, of course, that is happening is that the generation that lived through that experience, that dreadful experience, on all sides, victims, perpetrators, bystanders, is disappearing. And that means that the authentic voice is less easily able to be heard. But I think also these issues are being stoked up by particular kinds of leaders in various countries around the world. I'm thinking of Poland and Hungary, but also the United Kingdom and the United States, where there is an embrace, if you like, of a more nationalistic rhetoric. And that, I think, is what has opened the door to this kind of expression. I want to say one thing, though. I'm not sure that in the chatter and the discourse there is more of it around. I think it's always been there. I think the transformation is in social media and in technology. So we are now more easily aware of what is happening, and I'm not sure how we measure whether there is more of it or not.
Marian Tursky, you're joining us from Poland. As I mentioned, you are one of the last surviving victims of the Holocaust. You were sent to Auschwitz. When you see people today with T-shirts that read, "Welcome to Camp Auschwitz," in America, in Washington, D.C., celebrating essentially the Holocaust, what goes through your mind?
Well, Hala, you might be disappointed with my answer, but listen, I know very many my fellow survivors, they're very disgusted. They're very touched with those people wearing sweat shirts with Auschwitz macht frei, with Arbeit macht frei, with the work makes you free. But I will tell you, I am not offended. Imagine I sit in a bus, I sit in a train, I sit in a plane, and somebody next to me spits on me. He's drunk or he's maybe mentally retarded. Am I offended? It is not comfortable. I'm disgusted. I am to wipe it out on. But I cannot be offended. This is not a matter to be offended. It's a matter how it might be dangerous.
Yeah.
And this is another topic which I would like to speak afterwards.
Yes, we will absolutely be speaking of that. That is really what we're centering this discussion on, Deborah Lipstadt, how this is dangerous. Holocaust denial, you argue, is the same as democracy denial. And we've seen that in the United States. We're still seeing it in the United States.
Absolutely, Hala. But let me edit your question just a bit. Democracy denial of results of an election that has been certified by 60 courts and 89 judges, may not be the same as Holocaust denial, but the modus operandi, the way you go about it is the same. You take a fact, you turn it around, You make it into a lie, you make a positive into a negative, you repeat it, one person tells another, and then within time you have people saying, well, people say, or I've heard, and then whatever has happened is up to question. And I also want to pick up on something that was said earlier by one of the other panelists. Today, there's a difference because today we have a delivery system. When I first began in this field in the 90s, I thought I would spend 2 to 3 years working on it and then go on to other things. Little did I know. If you wanted to receive material on Holocaust denial, you had to get it in a plain envelope, often with no return address. Today, all I have to do is flip on the internet, put in my question, put in the item, and it will be there. It's all over the place. I want to add one last point. Holocaust denial is not a debate over facts. There are many aspects of the Holocaust you debate. That's what historians do all the time. How did it start? Who started it? Who was responsible? What could have been done? Holocaust denial is lies. It's distortion. It's taking something and just saying it didn't happen. No facts, no narrative, no evidence. You just say it didn't happen. But, and given that we're observing Holocaust Memorial Day, it's something else as well. It's anti-Semitism. It's a form of anti-Semitism. It's an invidious form of anti-Semitism.
Also, I'd like our panelists to stand by because the ambassador and chair of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Ambassador Michaela Küchle, I'd like for all of you to hear what she had to say in response to the question on how Holocaust denial and distortion is still a big issue today.
T-shirts with the words Camp Auschwitz written on them. An attack on a synagogue in Halle, Germany on Yom Kippur. We're seeing an alarming rise in Holocaust distortion and anti-Semitism. The very heart of our democracies is under attack. Holocaust distortion minimizes and misrepresents the Holocaust. It enables Holocaust denial and fuels anti-Semitism. There are 3 key actions we must take. Firstly, we need to protect the facts about this greatest crime in history. Secondly, we need to work together internationally to raise awareness of distortion. The IRA, therefore, recently created recommendations for policy and decision makers that help with recognizing and countering distortion. And finally, we need to build a strong coalition against distortion. We all must protect the facts. Join us in this crucial mission to uphold the truth.
Go ahead, Mr. Tursky, and then I'll get to Hella Pick for the next
I'd like to continue the last idea of Deborah Lipstadt. May I?
Of course, go ahead.
Dear listeners, my dear fellow panelists, well, maybe it is something, it is not a mistake, but something wrong in the reception, the audience reception, where they listen the term, the topic, Holocaust denial. Because in matter of fact, of course, Holocaust was something unprecedented. But if we speak about it today, it is because Holocaust denials, it means truth denials. It means denial of history facts. It means lies. This is what I want to continue. I was really it was so stuck in my memory, the moving, the touching post of Arnold Schwarzenegger. You remember when he spoke to the American people that he told, for the first time, he confessed that he grew up as a Catholic, that he was, for the first time, he confessed that his father used once or twice a week to come drunk, to scream, to scare his mother, maybe to beat. Why? Because it was painful memory. It was painful emotions. Because, and I repeat, I remember what we were, it was how he told it. It all started with lies, with lies, with lies. So when you start with lies, then the process of education builds another brain, another way of behavior.
Yeah.
There's nothing particular about Holocaust denial, okay, in this sense. I've worked, on Marianne's point, on cases in relation to Rwanda, in cases in relation to the former Yugoslavia. You have exactly the same denial of the facts articulated as lies, exactly as Marianne has said. So it's a widespread phenomenon, and one has to put it, I think, in that context.
No, absolutely. And that's a great point.
How started Rwanda with distributing by the broadcast lies about one people and another people. And after they started killing, mass killing in Rwanda, when you have so many lies. So this is why it is so dangerous.
Exactly. And the lies serve as a foundation for autocrats, for people who encourage violence against minorities, against vulnerable people and populations. Hella Pick, you serve on the board of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, where you're looking for solutions, because ultimately people want to know what to do, where to turn, what a possible solution is to this increase in distortion of history and historic facts that lead to this increase in hate crimes and rewriting of history. Where do you begin, Hella Pick?
I think this is, of course, the problem. You mentioned just now the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, the work that is being done there on extremism, which, of course, brought in the whole issue of the Holocaust denial. Their research is to identify the groups who are doing this, their motivation, what they're trying to achieve, in order to bring this into the public domain and create greater awareness. I would like, just for a moment, also to go back to my original work, the biography that I wrote of Simon Wiesenthal, because the message that he brought, I think, is as valid today as it was then. At the end of the war, he rushed into all the camps to try and get as much evidence, as much testimony from the victims in order to record that for the future. But he also always had this point of bringing the war criminals, the criminals to trial, in order not just for the sake of punishment, not at all. The object of this was to expose the facts and to bring the facts into the public domain.
It all started with lies and lies and lies and intolerance. So being from Europe, I've seen firsthand how things can spin out of control.
Many of you seem to be bringing up the Arnold Schwarzenegger video. So I'm going to ask Philippe Sands about it, because I know that I saw you tweeted about it and you have thoughts about it. You have a big star of Austrian origin who is equating the mob that stormed Congress with a historic event, Kristallnacht. I know you've said is not the best analogy. What did you make? It's almost at 40 million views. By the time this airs, it might be more. So it went hyper viral. Arnold Schwarzenegger pulled the Conan sword out, this movie prop to symbolize American democracy, and the more it's tested, the stronger it becomes, etc. What did you make of the fact that Arnold Schwarzenegger put this video out?
Fascinating, interesting, important. I've watched it and rewatched it probably now about 10 times. I discussed it with more than a dozen people. And I think the most interesting aspect of it for me is something that we haven't yet touched on, but which is relevant. We're talking a lot about what's in the public domain, the social media, Deborah has mentioned to it, I've mentioned to it, and the transmission of information. But for me, the crucial spaces are the families. What is talked about within the families, about what happened, about what the family's connection was. You mentioned generously a book that I've written, The Rat Line, which tells one tale about one Austrian family, the Wächters, and my exploration of the willingness or unwillingness of various family members to engage with what the grandfather, Otto Wächter, did or did not do during the war. The son is fascinating, Horst Wächter, because he's not a Holocaust denier and he's not an anti-Semite, but he denies that his father, who was involved in the mass murder of hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of Jews, he denies that he was in any way responsible. And that, for me, is the interesting space. At what point do the successors in families truly engage with what their forebears did or did not do? And what I'm so fascinated about, what I think actually is a very admirable intervention by Arnold Schwarzenegger, is the way he alluded to his father's potential role. He described his father coming home, shouting at the children, beating the children, shouting at the mother, and explaining it as something that his father and the neighbors' fathers lived, a result of what they lived through, what they saw, and maybe what they did. But the one thing that he didn't say was, my father was a member of the National Socialist Party. He was a Nazi. And it's this sort of unwillingness to actually grasp the reality of the past, I think, that contributes in its own way to some of the difficulties that we face. It's not just lies, 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 as Marianne rightly says.
Yeah.
It's silence. It's dealing with the family silences, and they multiply and they create a space in which the outpourings that we now get on social media, I think, become permissible, happen, and have their pernicious consequences.
And Deborah, you wanted to
I wanted
weigh
to
in on
add,
this
or to
point.
give just a case in point. I, who deal with Holocaust denial, I who have written about it, who fought court cases on it, I watched the Schwarzenegger video, and then Philippe and I immediately had an exchange because we were preparing for this this broadcast. And he said something about his not mentioning that his father was a Nazi. And I said, oh, yeah, he did. And because I heard in his saying what my father did, he was a drunk. I said, oh, he was a drunk because he was a member of the Nazi Party and he either saw or directly participated in killings. I read the subtext, which wasn't there. So if you didn't know, if you weren't attuned to it, you could easily miss that.
Right.
And I think what it gets to is not just silence, but silence about inconvenient history. So it's inconvenient history in a family. Opa war a Nazi, grandpa was a Nazi. Or it's inconvenient history in a country, Poland, rewriting its laws so that Poland doesn't deny the Holocaust, it just denies many of the Polish people's participation, profiting from it, acquisition, assisting, et cetera, collaboration. Rwanda, it's for certain people after Rwanda, it's inconvenient history. So if inconvenient history on a family level, Schwarzenegger et al., and he at least was more direct than many people whose parents and grandparents were involved, or nationally, in my country, we talk about, in the United States, we talk about the lost cause. What's the lost cause? That the South lost the Civil War. And if you say to someone who says it, I said, what was the cause? States' rights. States' rights for what? States' rights to own human beings. So inconvenient history gets rewritten, given new terminology, and you don't deny it, but you reshape it. And in essence, that's the bigger danger.
Yeah, we see that all around the world, of course. We see it even, I cover the Middle East a lot, certainly in autocratic repressive regimes that rewrite their history and that cloak themselves in just a kind of reworked reality, denying the actions that that have caused the death and suffering of civilians. I'm thinking of Syria in particular. Robert Williams, you wanted to weigh in on this point.
Yeah, and this is in part why I entered the field, right? Because my maternal grandfather fought for the Italian army during the course of the Second World War. Now, he was in Ethiopia. It was a different set of crimes, but we all grow up wanting to think that our forebears are heroes. but then we recognize that they're not. And this is an important lesson that needs to be imparted to every country that touches the Holocaust. The well-known Holocaust scholar Yehuda Bauer always says, anyone who touches the Holocaust is forever touched and changed by the experience of encountering the history. And this is also true for the people who were involved at the time, whether they were observing or the passive recipients or active perpetrators. And we need to have this encounter with the past if we're going to have a healthy relationship with the subject in a way that can help affirm a peaceable society. So how do we do that? We need to look at the past, warts and all. As Deborah said, we need to look at the myths that go into the creation of the United States, yes, but we also need to look at the myths that the United States was just a good guy in the course of the Second World War and a rescuer during the Holocaust. Deborah's written about this for decades, quite literally decades. And so too, at my home institution, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, we have an exhibition dealing with the various American responses to the Holocaust. And if Americans can begin wrestling with the degrees of our complicity in some of the events that happened, so too should the countries where the Holocaust actually took place.
Yeah. Marianne Tursky, you're in Eastern Europe, obviously. Our other panelists are not. From your vantage point, when you observe the rise in hate crimes, the resurgence of anti-Semitism in some cases, and Holocaust denial, how is it different, do you think, from someone living in the West?
Well, I wouldn't limit myself only to anti-Semitism. This is true. But in matter of fact, let me come back to one of my memories. It happened exactly in 1965, when I was on a fellowship in the United States, and I saved some money for my fellowship to go to Harab, to the Deep South, to look, to watch, to participate in the civil rights movement. So I went to Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, Louisiana. And I remember I bought, you would be amazed, a second-hand Volkswagen for $110 at the time, not more. And when I arrived to Magnolia, Mississippi, where there was a fire set to a school because it accepted Black students to be together with white, somebody noticed that next to me was a Black man. So they set fire to my car. So I was in those days, and then from Magnolia, I went straight to Selma, and I marched together with Martin Luther King from Selma to Montgomery. So while being in this time in America, I was very often asked, they knew that I survived Auschwitz, I survived death marches. They asked me, do you think, was it only exclusively typical for Germany, for this disciplined nation, listening to orders? Could it be repeated elsewhere? And I answered them, yes, it could be also here in the United States, provided you don't fight, you don't defend your constitution, provided you don't defend your democracy. Because why happened it? This is the secret of the being of a white poor man whose only treasure is his white skin. And he was afraid of being deprived of it. It would worsen his position, his status being in the society. So this is how this can begin.
Deborah Lipstadt, I mean, obviously you've written so many books on Holocaust denial. You were involved in a famous court case. Rachel Weisz, the gorgeous Rachel Weisz, plays you in a film.
But I won't meet with anyone who says the Holocaust didn't happen.
Professor Lipstadt, I am that David Irving.
Are you discouraged at all that decades after you first confronted Holocaust deniers, we're still talking about this today?
It would be easy to be discouraged, and it would be logical to be discouraged. But I'm not. I'm basically an optimistic person. We're having this conversation, but I'm frightened to some degree. I'm not frightened for myself. I'm not, trembling. But when I saw what happened in the Capitol on January 6th, these were not poor people. You know, everyone says, oh, it's the deplorables, the dispossessed. These were not the dispossessed. These were people filled with hate. And these were not people who were suddenly ginned up to go. They came prepared. They planned it. It was organized. We have the details on social media, and the governmental authorities are looking into it. But it is very disturbing. And now more than ever, and I say this, after having been involved in this field, as I said, for years, I think what is necessary is a proactive stance. We can't just say, oh, they're crazies, laugh them off.
Now I'd like us to hear from Alice Vairimu and Deritu. She's the United Nations Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide, and what she had to say in response to the question about Holocaust denial and distortion.
My name is Alice Vairimu Deritu, and I'm the United Nations Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. We observe National Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust, remembering the 6 million Jews and many more murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators, and recommit to prevent repetition of those crimes. The United Nations was created to build a world of justice and peace from the horrors of the Second World War, including the immense suffering of Holocaust victims, achieving, among other treaties, adoption of the Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of the Crime of Genocide and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. Today, we face an alarming erosion of values and systems created in response to the Holocaust, with upsurges in anti-Semitism, xenophobia, racism, neo-Nazis and supremacist movements, and efforts to diminish the Holocaust and deny responsibility of perpetrators. In the same continent the Holocaust happened, long-term vulnerable and minority communities are attack targets. Here in the United States, massive protests against police brutality on people of color symbolized the systemic racism against millions of people of African descent globally. Alarmingly, hate speech has risen. UN Secretary General said the COVID-19 pandemic unleashed a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, scapegoating and scaremongering, and urged action to strengthen the immunity of our societies against the virus of hate. Asking why many feel excluded and tempted to bigotry means we must transform governance institutions, document narratives, bridge gender and generational divides, and mentor change agents. Let's commemorate Holocaust victims by pursuing truth, remembrance, promoting non-discrimination, inclusion, a culture of respect for difference, and upholding of human rights. Thank you.
All of you will agree with this, of course. Hella Pick, the big question, how do you achieve this? How do you educate people?
That's the biggest question of the day. And if we all had the answer to that, of course, we could change the world. I think we have to go back to history. We have to remind people of what has happened, what took place. We have to relate it to our contemporary societies. I think what Deborah has just been talking about, I think, is so absolutely essential. We have to recognize in the manifestations that we see today what is happening on the right. We have to be able to relate that to what has happened in the past and draw the lessons from that, because that is the only way I think that you can begin to educate people to understand that they are letting loose events which then run completely out of control.
Robert Williams, you wanted to weigh in?
Briefly, I agree with everything that's been said. I think it's important to understand the state of the problem, though, before we can even get to the solutions. First and foremost, any attempt to bring about agents of change or greater awareness of the subject or to provide people with the tools needed to push back requires that we first always and never lose sight of the fact that we need to stay true to the facts. But beyond that, we need to figure out how to become better communicators. We need to be honest with ourselves. Those who sow hate are much better at reaching vulnerable audiences than those who are on the side of the truth. We need to figure out how to communicate without falling victim to the belief that we need to act just like the trolls. We also need to begin educating new audiences. For decades, we've invested quite heavily in secondary education on the Holocaust. That's very, very important. It's a foundation, but that's not where it ends. You need education at the university level, in technical schools, and especially among civil servants and professional groups, because those are the groups who can really carry forward the lessons that we learned over time. We all had classes in high school that we don't remember. I had ancient Greek. I can't even remember the alphabet. We need to keep learning if we're going to keep it internal. And finally, we need to wrestle with the new forms of communication before us. The internet, the lines of communication are not hierarchical like they were under older forms of media. They're much more horizontal. This is why terror groups, extremist groups, and others are able to attract lone wolves, because individuals are taking information from here, there, and everywhere. Education on the truth, on the Holocaust, and on other facts is still built more or less on hierarchical models, and we need to be able to adapt. Otherwise, we'll fall behind.
Yeah, and Philippe, that was going to, because Philippe, this is something that you're also studying. I mean, you're not going to put the genie back in the internet bottle. That's it. It's out. How do you deal with that?
It's a big question, Hala. You've got to, I think, get back to the underlying causes and the basics of what is going on. And one of the things I think that I've learned, I come from a family, my mother was a hidden child in Paris, Jewish. Many of her family members were exterminated. So I've seen that side of the story. But as my work has developed, I've worked on mass atrocities around the world. And there are always points of commonality. It always begins with hatred of the other. It's always them and us. And it's about one group or more than one group pointing at another group, which it alleges to be the source of its misfortunes. In some cases, the finger of hatred is expressed as anti-Semitism. But part of the same family, of course, is Islamophobia, is racism, and other analogous horrors.
If you look at deplatforming racist, bigoted commentators, it does work. I mean, if you look at Katie Hopkins, she's filing for bankruptcy. Who is Katie Hopkins? Nobody. You have Milo. I can't remember his last name. He's also going broke.
Yeah. Let's just have a moment.
But my point is that it does work in some cases. It does silence those voices.
Well, we don't know if it works. I wear another hat. I'm the president of English PEN, the Freedom of Expression Association, and I get very nervous when efforts are made, if you like, to tinker with or extinguish freedom of expression. Absolutely, if it incites violence, absolutely, it has to stop. But a private company like Twitter is not subject to the First Amendment in the United States in the same way, and therefore it can do what it wants. But do we open this door, for example, as some wish, and criminalize Holocaust denial? I have to say, my own sense is very skeptical. I don't think criminalizing certain forms of speech makes it go away. I think it makes it go underground. That is one of the lessons of the 1930s, is Austria criminalized all sorts of things in the late 20s and 1930s. They didn't go away. The Otto Wächters of this world continued underground until, boom, there was an explosion. So I'm not sure your analysis is right, Hala, but...
No, but I mean, what I'm saying is it's not part of the mainstream discussion. You're saying that basically this pushes these groups and these views underground, and they remain just as dangerous. Deborah, do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree to a certain extent. It makes it, first of all, when you criminalize it, you make it forbidden fruit. And forbidden fruit is always attractive, especially to young people. Oh, they say, I can't look at that. Whoops, we're off to look at it. But on the other hand, I think we have to be very aware of incitement. And you know, and draw that line maybe a little more strictly than we would have done in years past, because we know how easily it can lead down the road. You can't completely obliterate it. You know, they'll deplatform someone, they'll ban you, but it sends a message. It sends a message that this is not a free-for-all, that certain things are not acceptable. I know it's tricky, and I shudder that people in Silicon Valley, or some now they're moving to other places who used to be in Silicon Valley, are making these decisions. But we've got to address this. We've got to fix this some way. It calls for governmental action. I shudder with the level of the government sometimes of anything wise happening. But just to do nothing and say, well, you know, you can't ban the president of the United States from Twitter. Yes, you can, if he is saying things that incite people to mob action, and that's clear that that was the case.
I want to turn to Marian Turski. Mr. Turski, do you think it's a good idea? We've been discussing essentially silencing the voices of people who promote, who support and hate crimes, who promote anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. Is it a good idea to remove them from the discussion, do you think?
Well, to remove from this any discussion is nonsense, because, but sometimes, listen, this is a very delicate issue. Listen, we know, everybody of us is advocating freedom of speech, all civil rights, but there is a limit of any civil rights, of any right, human rights. It is so long it doesn't hurt another human being. And this is a very fragile place. It is a very delicate place.
Hella Pick, what is your view on this? Because it's a very hot topic. What do you do when we all embrace free speech, but do we censor, do we deplatform, do we silence those who are encouraging hate crimes and denying the crimes of the Holocaust and other crimes against humanity?
I think if anything good has come out of this discussion and out of all the recent events, it is that we have opened a discussion now on precisely the limits of free speech. And I think I, on one hand side, completely with Philippe in his capacity with pen, that we want free speech, that media have to be free to write, etc., etc. At the same time, I think extremism has brought out now in the social media that what are the limits of free speech? You know, I think it's a fundamental question. We've been wrestling with it for forever, really, but anyway, certainly for the last century or so. The social media have changed the situation out of all proportion in terms of the challenge that we face. And I think the only thing that we can really do at this point is to debate this issue fundamentally, because in itself, that brings up the issues that we are debating about. You know, why are we concerned about hate speech? Why are we concerned about Holocaust denial, about racial discrimination? By doing this, I think perhaps democratic societies will find the right answers, will find the right proportions, the right dimensions between legislation, film restriction on free speech, but I think it is a fundamental issue that modern societies have to confront if they to build and develop in our contemporary societies.
I'd now like us all to hear from Serge Klarsfeld, who's the UNESCO Special Envoy for Holocaust Education. This is what he had to say about Holocaust denial and distortion.
I am not afraid or worried as to the future of the memory of the Shoah. During these last 30 years, 50,000 books have been published in that field, and hundreds of theses of high quality have been produced. In each country in Europe where the Holocaust took place, a memorial has been created concerning the fate of the Jews in that country. A precise response has been given by historians to all negationists who claim that the gas chambers were an invention, that the number of 6 million should be divided by 10, or that Hitler was not responsible for the final solution of the Jewish question. Nonetheless, there are everywhere millions of irrational and gullible people who are influenced by the dark side of internet or simply do not want to believe the images of mass killing of Jews. They want to believe the propagandists full of hate against the Jews who, like always, want to blame the Jews and Israel for all the wrongs in our world. It is necessary to stop that anti-Jewish propaganda on the internet. The Claims Conference campaign to convince Mark Zuckerberg to ban on Facebook against negationism is a success. Other platforms like Twitter will in time follow.
Rob Williams, what is your reaction to that?
I appreciate where Mr. Klarsfeld is coming from, and very few people have done as much as he has to try to affirm and then sustain memory of the Holocaust over time. But I am worried. You know, I'm originally trained as an historian, and, you know, if you look at other major historical moments, you have, let's take the French Revolution, since Serge is from France. You have the French Revolution, which was a subject that people really didn't talk about for a generation or so due to, you know, Napoleon and other factors. But then historians began talking about producing books. And now the French Revolution is recognized for what it is, one of these civilizational breaks that has shaped our present. You had another major revolution, though, the revolutions of 1848. Not as much work was done. The vast majority of people, whether they're in Europe and certain parts of Europe or the United States, don't even know about the 1848 revolutions anymore. And that's because the sustained work at the educational, the scholarly, and other levels just did not take place. If we retreat from, if we begin to question the validity of aspects of Holocaust history, I think Serge is right. It'll be around for a generation, but then in another generation or two, it can fade very quickly and not be recognized for what it is. The Holocaust was a civilizational break akin to a revolution that shapes the present in which we live.
Hella Pick, as we look forward to 2021, after all the stresses and the anxieties related to the pandemic, to the last few weeks and days of the Trump presidency in the United States, of all that's happening in Europe, where do you think we're headed when it comes to the specific topic of Holocaust denial? Are you positive looking forward?
Well, I think we could now start another few hours conversation. How are we going to come out of our present situation? How will we see all this in terms of the discussion we've been having? I think certain facts, this is not going to go away. We will still have to grapple with what happened in the past and how we relate it to our current existence. We will still have to be thinking about the role of the social media and whether they're platforms or publishers and all the rest of it. But I think how we are going to come out of the pandemic, how society is going to recreate this concept of normality to which we're all clinging is something I think each individual has to grapple with, which governments have to grapple which all communities have to grapple with. And I mean, I'm very curious, but I don't think I've got all the answers yet. So that's not very helpful.
It is very helpful. Marianne Tursky, what is your final thought today as we bring this discussion to a close?
A good question. I would like to refer to Robert's statement. Yes, he is right. There have been in history of mankind, in Europe's history, some landmarks. French Revolution was one of the landmarks which created not only new attitudes, new approach, new relations, but also new mentality. From this point of view, I am absolutely sure that it was, of course, late, not at the same time, after a long time, not at the same time in Germany, in Netherlands, in Poland, in other countries, but the Holocaust is a kind of a revolution in European mentality, and it will have an impact for a long time, at least for 100 years. And this is what is maybe at least the positive result of it.
I'll ask you the same question, Philippe Sands. Final thought from you.
Well, I mean, the events that gave rise to the Holocaust between 1933 and 1945 certainly did lead to a revolutionary moment, and that was the transformation of the international order in 1945. It was akin to what happened in the late 18th century, particularly in France. And that revolution, which culminated in an extraordinary summer of 1945, the drafting of the United Nations Charter, the creation of the Nuremberg Tribunal, followed by the Universal Declaration on Human Rights 3 years later, and the adoption and later entry into force of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, were all reinforced around a single fundamental idea. The sovereign is not absolutely powerful. Individuals and groups have rights, not only under domestic law, but under international law. And what the terrible events of 33 to 45 gave rise to, it's the sort of silver lining, to take Marianne's analogy, is that revolutionary moment. And that will be sustained so long as countries like Britain and the United States and many others support what happened then. The danger, of course, is that we have in those two countries a withdrawal from that 1945 moment. Now, it may have been arrested in the United States. I don't think it's been arrested in the United Kingdom.
Rob Williams?
Well, I'll start with the positive takeaways because I tend to be somewhat Pollyannish. And the positive takeaways are we're having these conversations more and more often. Over the course of just the last year and a half, discussions at the political level about anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial and distortion, and related forms of bias have become much more frequent. So our readers are beginning to recognize at an international and at domestic levels that these problems need to be tackled and that they're beginning to spiral out of control. So that in and of itself is a cause for optimism. There's also cause for optimism at the broad social level. I think the moment that we are in, whether it's the events from last week or just the events that we've been seeing with the rise of certain conspiracy theories, have led not just to a certain sense of fatigue, but a sense by the broader public that enough is enough. And we need to begin to do something about these extreme ideologies that have now become somewhat mainstream. And I think we may be at an inflection point where we can begin to round that corner. But there's a lot that we need to remain vigilant against. One is the tendency to politicize these issues. You know, back in 1984, 1985, I was only 6 or 7 years old, but still, Ronald Reagan had a meeting with Elie Wiesel. And Elie Wiesel was talking to him about Reagan's forthcoming visit to the Bitburg Cemetery. This was 85. And he said to him, Mr. President, you need to realize that these issues, the issue of Holocaust truth, it's not politics. It's about good and evil, and you should never mix the two. Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of that mixing today around Holocaust issues, around anti-Semitism and bias issues. And by politicizing it, it becomes a brickbat that one opponent can throw against another, and that just leads to a degeneration of the conversation. The other thing that we really need to remain vigilant against, to be quite honest, is the fact that although the vast majority of the public will reject these extreme ideologies, the fact that they are so available the prevalence of Holocaust denial and distortion in a certain sense acts as a gateway drug to more extreme, dangerous ideologies, as a recruitment tool, bit by bit, to use Deborah's language from earlier, that bit by bit over time, invite people to not only believe these falsehoods and to take in this hate, but in a certain sense to radicalize them to violence.
Right, and violence against so many, as you mentioned, Philippe, minority communities as well. Deborah Lipstadt, final word to you.
I think, first of all, let's remember that when we're talking about the Holocaust, we're talking about a state-sponsored genocide that went after people not just within the boundaries of Germany or even German-controlled territory, but wherever they could get to them. The island of Rhodes, you know, they sent boats to the island of Rhodes to take the Jews in 1944 when it was clear that the Nazis were losing the war. We're talking about something of unbelievable proportions. Yet, the thing to remember, and I've said it before, but I think it bears repeating, and Rob just said it as well, this was step by step by step. And that doesn't mean that if another country or in another era, even in our own era, if we're at a similar step to the Nazis, that we're saying we're going to end up with a genocide. Not at all. But you don't know till you end up there. So the time to stop it is before it happens. The time to be proactive is now. And we've talked about what happened in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. No one's comparing that to a genocide, but that was like the time of the beer hall putsch in the early 20s. That's democracy can be attacked from within. And I think the final point I want to make is that some of our listeners will think, oh, it's Holocaust Remembrance Day. This is about Jews. It's not about Jews. It's about, as Rob said, and as Elie Wiesel said to President Ronald Reagan, it's about good and evil. And it's about the fragility of democracy. Democracy can be destroyed from without, from enemies from outside your borders, but democracy can be destroyed from within. When you attack the legitimacy of your democratic institutions, your courts, your governments, your media, democracy is fragile. And the only people who can make sure that that fragility is protected and it isn't destroyed is every one of us.
All right.
Thank you, Marion, my good friend.
Thank you so much to all of you. Thank you for taking part in this fascinating discussion on this very important International Holocaust Remembrance Day. I want to thank Hella Pick, Marianne Tursky, Deborah Lipstadt, Rob Williams, Philippe Sands. Thanks to all of you. It was my pleasure. And for all of you watching, do stay tuned for closing remarks.
Thank you, Hala Gurani, and our panelists for this engaging and important session. Friends, we have come to the end of the program of observance marking the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust. I want to thank again our partners, UNESCO and the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and also to thank CNN for its valuable contribution. While the observance program ends today, Holocaust education and remembrance continues every day throughout the world. Rising Holocaust denial and distortion demands action from each and every one of us. I ask you to raise awareness by supporting the hashtag Protect the Facts campaign, launched last week by the United Nations, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and the European Commission. The United Nations works to bring education about the Holocaust to local populations around the globe. We encourage you to visit the websites of both the Holocaust and the United Nations Outreach Program and UNESCO for details of the various events and activities planned throughout the year. Finally, I wish to thank you for joining us today, for standing with us as we reflect and recommit to a world in which we can live in peace, with dignity, and where justice, truth, and mutual respect prevails. Goodbye, stay safe, and be well.